The Supreme Court hearing room fell silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the microphone. Justice Brett Kavanaugh sat confidently behind the bench, that familiar smirk playing across his face. He had just dismissed her previous question with a wave of his hand, and an audible chuckle that echoed through the marble halls. The 33-year-old congresswoman from Texas looked small standing before the 9 justices, but what she said next would wipe that smile off Kavanaugh's face forever. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice steady despite the tension, "I have one more question that I think deserves a real answer, not laughter." Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, still grinning, clearly expecting another softball he could easily deflect. He had no idea what was coming. What happened in the next 30 seconds would not only silence the room but send shock waves through Washington, D.C. and beyond. The viral moment that followed would make Crockett a household name and leave Kavanaugh's reputation hanging by a thread. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of these explosive political moments. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deep divisions in American politics and show the world that sometimes the most powerful people can be brought down by the truth. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why their clash mattered so much to millions of Americans. Representative Jasmine Crockett had been making waves since arriving in Congress just 2 years earlier. At 33, she was one of the youngest members of the House, a former public defender from Dallas, who had fought her way through law school while working multiple jobs. Her background was about as different from the Washington elite as you could get. She grew up in a working-class family, knew what it meant to struggle for every opportunity, and had spent years defending people who couldn't afford high-risk-to-do lawyers. But don't let her relative newcomer status fool you. Crockett had already earned a reputation as someone who did her homework, asked tough questions, and wasn't intimidated by powerful men in expensive suits. Her colleagues called her fearless, sometimes as a compliment, sometimes as a warning. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, represented everything the establishment held dear. At 59, he had spent decades climbing the ladder of conservative legal circles, Ivy League educated, former Bush administration insider, and now lifetime appointee to the highest court in the land. His confirmation hearings had been among the most contentious in Supreme Court history, but he had survived the storm and now sat on the bench with the ultimate job security. Kavanaugh was known for his sharp legal mind, but also for his sometimes dismissive attitude toward what he saw as grandstanding by liberal politicians. He had a habit of cutting off questions he didn't like and wasn't shy about showing when he thought someone was wasting his time. This wasn't just any Supreme Court hearing. The case at hand involved voting rights in Texas, specifically whether new restrictions on mail-in ballots violated the Constitution for millions of Americans, especially in communities of color and rural areas. This decision could determine whether their voices would be heard in future elections. Crockett wasn't just representing her district that day, she was speaking for everyone who had ever felt like the system was rigged against them. Everyone who had been told to sit down and shut up by people in power. The room was packed with reporters, legal scholars, and activists from both sides. C-SPAN cameras were rolling. Every major news network had correspondents present. Whatever happened here would be dissected, analyzed, and debated for weeks to come. This confrontation didn't happen in a vacuum. For the past 2 hours, Kavanaugh had been increasingly dismissive of questions from Democratic representatives. He had interrupted Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mid-sentence, rolled his eyes at Congressman Jamie Razin's constitutional arguments, and generally acted like he was doing everyone a favor by being there. But it was his treatment of Crockett that really set the stage for what was about to unfold. When she first approached the microphone an hour earlier, he had barely looked up from his notes when she asked about the court's previous voting rights decisions. He gave a curt book answer that said nothing, and when she pressed him on the real-world impact of those decisions, he actually chuckled and said, "Congresswoman, I think you might be better served by taking a civics class." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Several gasps could be heard from the gallery. Crockett's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took notes, made some quick phone calls during the break, and prepared for round 2. What Kavanaugh didn't know was that Crockett had spent the break doing what she did best, digging into the legal record and preparing the kind of question that could cut through years of careful political positioning like a knife through butter. As the hearing resumed after the lunch break, you could feel the electricity in the room. Word had spread about the morning's tense exchanges, and now the gallery was fuller than before. Legal Twitter was buzzing. Cable news producers were telling their anchors to stand by for potential breaking news. Crockett walked back to the microphone with a different energy than before. Gone was any hint of nervousness or difference. Her posture was straight, her eyes focused, and she carried a thick folder that she placed Deliberately on the podium, Kavanaugh meanwhile seemed completely relaxed. He was chatting quietly with Justice Thomas, occasionally glancing toward the Democratic representatives with what could only be described as amusement. If anything, his morning performance had boosted his confidence. He had handled the liberal questioning easily, made his points clearly, and even gotten some laughs from the conservative justices. "Justice Kavanaugh," Crockett began, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the chamber, "I'd like to return to the issue of voting access, if I may." Kavanaugh looked up with that same slightly condescending smile. "Of course, Congresswoman, though I hope we can keep this more focused than our earlier discussion." The word discussion came out dripping with sarcasm. A few chuckles rippled through the conservative side of the gallery. Chief Justice Roberts shifted uncomfortably in his center seat, clearly sensing the tension building. "Justice Kavanaugh, in your 2018 confirmation hearings you stated, and I quote, 'Voting is a fundamental right in our democracy. Do you still hold that view?'" Kavanaugh nodded, looking almost bored. "Of course, Congresswoman, that's basic constitutional law. And would you agree that any barriers that prevent eligible citizens from exercising that fundamental right should be subject to strict scrutiny by the courts? Generally speaking, yes. Though the devil is always in the details," his tone suggested. He was humoring a child who didn't understand how the grown-up world worked. Crockett flipped open her folder and pulled out a document. "Then I'm sure you can explain why, in your opinion, for the court in the 2023 case of Williams versus Texas, you wrote that a 2-hour wait to vote was not an undue burden on voters." Kavanaugh's smile faltered slightly. He clearly hadn't expected her to cite specific cases. "The Williams case involved multiple factors. Congresswoman, you're oversimplifying a complex decision. Am I?" Crockett pulled out another document. "Because according to the data submitted in that case, the average wait time in predominantly white precincts was 12 minutes, while predominantly Black and Latino precincts averaged over 2 hours. Did those facts influence your decision?" The mom room was getting quieter now. Reporters were leaning forward. Even the other justices were paying closer attention to the exchange. Kavanaugh's response was sharper than before. "Congresswoman, correlation is not causation. The court cannot make decisions based on political narratives." But Crockett wasn't backing down. If anything, his dismissive tone seemed to fuel her intensity. "Political narratives, Justice Kavanaugh, is that what you call the testimony of elderly voters who couldn't stand in line for 2 hours, the working mothers who had to choose between voting and picking up their children from daycare, the disabled veterans who couldn't physically manage those wait times." Kavanaugh was no longer smiling. His face was flushing slightly, and his voice had an edge to it. "Congresswoman, if you're going to question my decisions, at least have the courtesy to understand the legal framework we operate within." "Oh, I understand the framework perfectly, Justice Kavanaugh. What I'm questioning is whether you understand the real-world impact of your decisions." That's when Kavanaugh made his crucial mistake. He let out a short, sharp laugh, not a chuckle, but the kind of dismissive laugh that says this person has no idea what they're talking about. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, still chuckling, "with all due respect, I've been practicing constitutional law since before you were out of high school. I think I understand these issues quite well." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Even Justice Ginsburg, who had been quiet all morning, looked up sharply. Crockett stood there for a moment, letting Kavanaugh's words hang in the air. The laughter had stopped, but the damage was done. He had just dismissed a sitting member of Congress, a licensed attorney, and a woman who had fought voter suppression cases for years as essentially too young and inexperienced to understand constitutional law. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Crockett looked down at her folder, then back up at Kavanaugh. When she spoke again, her voice was deadly calm. "Justice Kavanaugh, since you brought up my age and experience, let me ask you about yours." Kavanaugh's eyebrows raised slightly. He clearly hadn't expected that response. "You graduated from Yale Law School in 1990, correct?" "That's correct. And you've spent the majority of your career in Washington, D.C. working in federal government and federal courts." "Yes, that's part of the public record." "So you've never actually practiced voting rights law at the ground level, have you? Never represented individual voters who were disenfranchised, never worked with community organizations trying to register voters in underserved communities?" Kavanaugh's jaw tightened. "My experience speaks for itself, Congresswoman, does it?" Crockett pulled out yet another document from her seemingly endless folder. "Because I have here your financial disclosure forms from your confirmation hearing, and according to these documents, you've never lived in a neighborhood where the median income was below $75,000. You've never had to worry about taking time off work to vote because you'd lose pay. You've never had to figure out child care for a 2-hour wait in line." The room was dead silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. Kavanaugh was no longer smiling. At all, his face had gone from slightly flushed to pale, but Crockett still wasn't done. She had been building to this moment all along, and everyone in the room could sense that something big was coming. Justice Kavanaugh, you laughed at my questions about voting access. You dismissed the experiences of thousands of Americans as political narratives. You questioned my ability to understand constitutional law. So let me ask you one final question, and I hope you'll give it the serious consideration it deserves. She paused, looking directly at him. Kavanaugh seemed to sense that he was walking into a trap, but there was no way out now. All he could do was nod and wait for the question. Given your privileged background, your lifetime appointment, and your admitted lack of experience with voter suppression at the community level, what gives you the moral authority to decide whether a 2-hour wait to vote is an undue burden for people whose lives you've never lived? The question hit like a thunderbolt. Several reporters were already typing furiously on their phones. The other justices looked stunned. Even Kavanaugh's usual allies on the court seemed taken back by the directness of the challenge. But before Kavanaugh could formulate a response, Crockett delivered the line that would make headlines around the world. Kavanaugh opened his mouth to respond, clearly expecting to deliver another dismissive answer that would put this upstart congresswoman in her place. His expression suggested he was about to lecture her on judicial independence, constitutional interpretation, or the separation of powers, but Crockett wasn't finished before he could say a word. She held up her hand and delivered the line that would be replayed on every news channel for the next week. Because Justice Kavanaugh, the only thing more dangerous than a judge who doesn't understand the Constitution is a judge who doesn't understand the people it's supposed to protect, and right now you've shown us you understand neither. The room didn't just go quiet, it went ice cold. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Kavanaugh's mouth was still open, but no words came out for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Brett Kavanaugh was speechless. You could see the exact moment the words hit him. His face went from confident to confused to angry to something approaching panic in the span of about 3 seconds. His hands, which had been casually folded in front of him, suddenly gripped the edge of the bench just as Thomas leaned over and whispered something to him, but Kavanaugh didn't seem to hear it. He was staring directly at Crockett, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. Chief Justice Roberts, clearly sensing the need to intervene, started to say something, but Crockett wasn't done yet. And just so we're clear, Justice Kavanaugh, I graduated from law school magna laud while working 2 jobs to pay for it. I've represented over 200 clients in voting rights cases. I've registered over 5,000 voters in underserved communities. And yes, I've waited in line for 2 hours to vote because that's what democracy looks like for people who don't have drivers and security details. The impact was immediate and devastating. You could literally see the shock wave ripple through the room. Justice Ginsburg was nodding almost imperceptibly. Justice Breyer was leaning forward, clearly impressed. Even Justice Gorsuch, usually Kavanaugh's reliable ally, was looking at his colleague with something approaching concern. But it was the reaction in the gallery that really told the story. The lawyers and activists who had been sitting quietly all morning were now on the edge of their seats. Several people were holding up phones to record. One law professor was frantically taking notes, and the reporters, they looked like they had just witnessed a car crash and a lottery winner announcement at the same time. This was the kind of moment that defined careers, the kind of exchange that would be taught in journalism schools for years to come. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Kavanaugh finally found his voice, but instead of the confident judicial tone he had been using all morning, his words came out shaky and defensive. Congresswoman, that's quite an accusation you're making, he stammered. I take my responsibilities very seriously, and I resent the implication that my background somehow disqualifies me from understanding the law. But even as he spoke, you could see that he knew he had lost his usual commanding presence was gone. He looked small behind the big bench, diminished by the power of Crockett's words. Crockett, meanwhile, stood taller than ever. Her voice remained calm and steady as she delivered her response. Justice Kavanaugh, I'm not questioning your qualifications. The Senate already confirmed those. I'm questioning your judgment, and your laughter at the struggles of American voters speaks to a judgment that seems to have been compromised by a lifetime of privilege. That's when Crockett pulled out her final piece of evidence, the one that would seal Kavanaugh's fate in this exchange. Since you mentioned my experience, let me share something that might help you understand why this matters so much to me. 3 years ago, my grandmother, who is 87 years old and has voted in every election since 1960, was told she couldn't vote by mail during the pandemic because she didn't meet the strict requirements Texas had put in place. She had to stand in line for 3.5 hours leaning on her walker just to exercise the fundamental right you say you care so much about. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. She made it through that line. Justice Kavanaugh, she voted, but she shouldn't have had to prove her patriotism by risking her health. And the fact that you can't see the difference between a 12-minute wait and a 3-in-1/2-hour ordeal tells me everything I need to know about how removed you are from the reality most Americans face. But Crockett still had one more arrow in her quiver. She pulled out a final document and held it up for everyone to see. This is a photo of my grandmother in that voting line, Justice Kavanaugh. She asked me to show it to anyone who thought voting was easy, she said. Maybe some people need to see what democracy actually costs. She held up the photo, a powerful image of an elderly black woman leaning heavily on her walker in a long line of voters' determination etched on her weathered face. So the next time you're tempted to laugh at questions about voting access, I want you to remember this face, because this is who you're really ruling on when you decide that 2 hours isn't an undue burden. This is who pays the price for your legal theories. By this point, Kavanaugh looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. His face had gone from pale to red to pale again. His hands were visibly shaking when he tried to respond. His voice cracked. The court always considers. We don't make these decisions lightly. But his words carried no weight. The fire had gone out of him completely. The man who had spent the morning dismissing challenges with confident arrogance now looked defeated and small. Chief Justice Roberts, clearly recognizing that this was spiraling out of control, finally intervened. I think we should move on to the next question, he said firmly. But Crockett wasn't quite finished. She had one final line that would echo through legal and political circles for months to come. Thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. I have no further questions for Justice Kavanaugh. I think he's answered them quite clearly already. As Crockett walked back to her seat, the silence in the room was deafening. Then slowly applause began to build from the gallery. It started with one person, then two, then dozens. Chief Justice Roberts gave for order. But the damage was done. Kavanaugh sat frozen behind the bench, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He didn't participate meaningfully in the rest of the hearing. When other representatives asked questions, he gave short, monotone answers. The swagger was gone. Justice Thomas leaned over several times to whisper to him, but Kavanaugh just stared straight ahead. It was as if Crockett's words had broken something fundamental in his composure. Meanwhile, the other justices were clearly processing what they had just witnessed. Justice Ginsburg was smiling slightly. Justice Breyer was nodding thoughtfully. Even some of the conservative justices looked uncomfortable with how their colleague had handled the exchange. The reporters in the room were practically vibrating with excitement. They had just witnessed a Supreme Court justice get completely dismantled by a relatively junior member of Congress. This was the kind of moment that would define both of their careers, though in very different ways. As the hearing finally adjourned an hour later, Kavanaugh was the first justice to leave the bench. He didn't make eye contact with anyone and walked quickly toward the exit. It was a far cry from his usual practice of lingering to chat with colleagues or staff. Before Kavanaugh had even left the courtroom, the video was already going viral. Someone in the gallery had live streamed the entire exchange on Twitter. And within minutes, Kavanaugh laughs was trending nationwide. The clip of Kavanaugh's dismissive laugh, followed by Crockett's devastating response, was being shared at a rate of hundreds of retweets per minute. Political Twitter went absolutely insane. Cable news producers were frantically calling their on-air talent back to the studio. The most shared clip was a 90-second supercut that started with Kavanaugh's condescending "I think I understand these issues quite well" comment included his laugh, and ended with Crockett's ice cold. The only thing more dangerous than a judge who doesn't understand the Constitution is a judge who doesn't understand the people it's supposed to protect. Within 3 hours, the hashtag had over 100,000 tweets. By the end of the day, it was approaching 500,000 Twitter users had a field day with the footage. The most popular meme format showed Kavanaugh's confident smile in the first panel, his laugh in the second, and his shell-shocked expression after Crockett's response in the third. One viral tweet read, "Kavanaugh really thought he was going to dismiss this woman like she was asking for the manager at Whole Foods. Instead, she gave him a constitutional law lesson he'll never forget." Another popular meme showed the photo of Crockett's grandmother with the caption, "When your granddaughter schools a Supreme Court justice on democracy." The conservative response was swift, but largely ineffective. Attempts to defend Kavanaugh or attack Crockett were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of support for the Congresswoman's performance. By 6 p.m., every major news network was leading with the story. CNN's Kyron read, "Supreme Court Justice laughs at voting rights concerns." MSNBC went with Crockett silences Kavanaugh with devastating takedown. Even Fox News, typically friendly to conservative justices, led with heated exchange at Supreme Court hearing. The coverage was overwhelmingly focused on Kavanaugh's misstep. Legal analysts across the political spectrum agreed that laughing at a sitting member of Congress was inappropriate regardless of their policy disagreements. Harvard Law Professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 40 years of watching Supreme Court proceedings, I've never seen a justice so thoroughly dismantled by a member of Congress." Crockett's response was both legally sound and morally powerful. Even some conservative commentators struggled to defend Kavanaugh's behavior. Wall Street Journal editorial board member Kimberly Strauss-Sell wrote, "Justice Kavanaugh's dismissive attitude toward legitimate constitutional concerns was unbecoming of his office. Within hours, politicians from both parties were weighing in. Progressive Democrats hailed Crockett as a hero, while moderate Democrats praised her substantive approach to questioning judicial overreach. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi issued a statement saying, "Representative Crockett demonstrated today why we need more voices like hers in Congress, voices that understand both the law and the lived experiences of ordinary Americans." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what accountability looks like." Jasmine Crockett just reminded a Supreme Court justice that his job is to serve the people, not dismiss them. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for an ethics investigation into Kavanaugh's conduct during the hearing, saying, "Supreme Court justices must treat all members of Congress with respect regardless of their political differences." The Republican response was notably muted and divided. Some conservative voices tried to defend Kavanaugh, but their arguments fell flat in the face of the video evidence. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, typically a reliable conservative voice, notably refused to criticize Crockett when asked about the exchange. Representative Crockett was advocating for her constituents, he said. "That's what we elect her to do." Even some of Kavanaugh's usual defenders seemed reluctant to go to bat for him. The silence from prominent conservative legal scholars was deafening. The few attempts to attack Crockett personally backfired spectacularly. When one Republican congressman suggested she had been disrespectful, the response was swift and brutal. Videos of white male politicians interrupting and dismissing women of color flooded social media, creating an uncomfortable context that made criticism of Crockett appear hypocritical. Perhaps most damaging for Kavanaugh was the response from the legal community itself. Bar associations, law schools, and individual attorneys across the country issued statements expressing concern about his behavior. The American Bar Association issued a rare statement saying, "All members of the legal profession, especially those in positions of public trust, should demonstrate respect for the democratic process and those who participate in it." Law students at Yale, Kavanaugh's alma mater, organized a letter-writing campaign calling for their administration to distance itself from their graduates' behavior. The letter, signed by over 300 students, read, "Justice Kavanaugh's dismissive attitude toward democratic participation is contrary to everything we're taught about the rule of law." As the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't just a bad news cycle for Kavanaugh, it was a fundamental shift in how he would be perceived by the public and his colleagues. Crockett, meanwhile, became an overnight sensation. Her congressional office was flooded with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and appearances. Democratic fundraising groups reported a massive spike in donations with her name attached. More importantly, her substantive approach to the confrontation, using specific cases, personal experiences, and documented evidence, became a template for how to effectively challenge powerful figures. Political science professors began assigning the video as an example of effective oversight and accountability. Legal ethics experts began raising serious questions about whether Kavanaugh's behavior violated judicial conduct rules. While Supreme Court justices are not subject to the same ethical oversight as lower court judges, the consensus among experts was that his conduct was problematic. Georgetown law professor Ryan Fahey wrote in the Washington Post, "Justice Kavanaugh's behavior raises serious questions about his fitness for the highest court in the land. Judges who cannot treat lawmakers with basic respect are judges who have forgotten their place in our constitutional system." Calls for Kavanaugh's recusal from voting rights cases began to grow. Civil rights organizations argued that his dismissive attitude toward voter concerns demonstrated bias that would prevent him from fairly considering such cases. Beyond the immediate political fallout, the Crockett-Kavanaugh exchange became a cultural touchstone for broader conversations about privilege, power, and respect in American society. The image of Crockett's grandmother in the voting line became an iconic symbol of determination and democratic participation. T-shirts featuring the photo with the caption "Democracy Costs" began appearing at rallies and protests. Educational institutions began using the exchange as a teaching tool for discussions about privileged judicial independence and effective advocacy. High school debate teams studied Crockett's approach as an example of how to build a persuasive argument. While Crockett's star rose, Kavanaugh faced the most difficult period of his tenure on the Supreme Court. His confidence, which had been a defining characteristic of his judicial demeanor, seemed permanently shaken. Court observers noted that he became much more subdued in subsequent hearings. His questions were shorter and more deferential. The dismissive attitude that had characterized his earlier years on the court was notably absent. Former clerks and colleagues reported that he was deeply affected by the public reaction to the exchange. One former clerk, speaking anonymously, said he really didn't expect that level of pushback. It made him realize how his Behavior was being perceived for Crockett. The viral moment was both an opportunity and a burden. Overnight, she became one of the most recognizable members of Congress with all the attention and scrutiny that entailed, but she handled the spotlight with the same grace and substance she had shown in the Supreme Court hearing and interviews. She consistently brought the focus back to voting rights and the experiences of ordinary Americans. "This was never about me versus Justice Kavanaugh," she said in a CNN interview. "This was about ensuring that the people who make decisions about our democracy understand what democracy actually looks like for most Americans." Her fundraising exploded, allowing her to expand her voter registration and education programs. Within 6 months, her organization had registered over 50,000 new voters, many of them inspired by her Supreme Court performance. A year later, the Crockett-Kavanaugh exchange is still referenced regularly in political and legal circles. It's become shorter than for the power of preparation, the importance of lived experience in policy, and the danger of dismissing voices that challenge conventional wisdom. Law schools now teach the exchange as an example of effective cross-examination technique. Political training programs use it to show how personal narrative can be combined with legal expertise to create powerful advocacy. Most importantly, it changed the conversation about who belongs in spaces of power and how they should be treated when they get there. Crockett's performance demonstrated that respect is earned through competence and substance, not just credentials and connections. The exchange also raised broader questions about the Supreme Court's relationship with democratic institutions and the American people. If justices are going to make decisions that affect millions of lives, should they not be expected to understand those lives? Crockett's challenge to Kavanaugh was ultimately a challenge to the entire system. How can we expect justice from judges who have never experienced injustice? How can we trust decisions about voting access from people who have never had to fight for access? These questions don't have easy answers, but Crockett's performance proved that they can't be laughed away or dismissed with legal jargon. They demand serious consideration from anyone who claims to serve the American people. The day Jasmine Crockett walked up to that microphone, she was just one of 435 members of Congress asking questions. At a routine Supreme Court hearing, when she walked away, she had become a symbol of accountability, preparation, and the power of speaking truth to power. Her confrontation with Brett Kavanaugh wasn't just a viral moment, it was a masterclass in how to effectively challenge authority while staying substantive and respectful. She proved that you don't have to raise your voice to make powerful people listen, you just have to know what you're talking about and be willing to stand up for what's right. If you found this breakdown as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're constantly covering the moments that shape American politics, and you won't want to miss the next explosive confrontation. What did you think about Crockett's approach? Was her challenge to Kavanaugh appropriate, or did she go too far? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing different perspectives on these complex political moments. And remember, in a democracy, accountability doesn't just happen in voting booths. Sometimes it happens when brave people are willing to ask hard questions and demand real answers. Jasmine Crockett reminded us all that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, is above being held accountable to the people they serve. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.